We're living our truth now. Crystal, what?
Krista who?
Christadelphian?
Did you say Christian Dolphin? So are you from Philadelphia?
Welcome to the Life After Leaving podcast, an ex-Christadelphian podcast.
Hello, heathens, and welcome back to the podcast. I'm your host, Zinnia. Today's guest is Steve. Thank you for joining us today, Steve.
My pleasure.
Today, I want to hear your story of becoming an ex-Christadelphian, so we'll go through your experiences. But before we get started, could you share what region of the world you're in?
I'm in Sydney, Australia.
And how long has it been since you left the Christadelphians?
It's about 20 years. I say it's about because we kind of drifted away and didn't make a decision to leave on any particular date or any particular year. We just drifted away, and it doesn't seem that long ago. But when I think back, it must be about 20 years ago where that drift started.
Wow. Okay. Well, it's going to be fun to hear the whole story about how you got there. So let's get started at the beginning. Were you born into the group?
I was born into the group. My parents were born into the group as well. And my grandparents converted, so I'm third generation Christadelphian. Okay. My wife is about at least fifth generation Christadelphian, so she's Christadelphian royalty, I suppose.
Especially if she's a big family, that helps too.
Yeah, and her forebears, they've got memories going back to Robert Roberts being in Australia and things like that. And
another one, yes, so many Australians have that link.
Yeah. So,
very cool. So do you want to tell me a little bit about your childhood? If you want to talk about your home life or the ecclesia, anything that you remember that sticks out to you?
I grew up in a very loving family. I have only good memories. I should correct that. Mostly good memories.
Okay, that feels more honest.
Yeah, of growing up. In terms of the family, my parents were great. I have no criticisms of my parents at all and the way we were brought up. It was a very loving family. My father, both parents were very honest, but my father, I think, particularly so. I remember at my father's funeral, for example, and we wasn't in a Christadelphian church, so we had a chapel and it was overflowing, and there was hundreds of people from the community that came, people I didn't even know. And it wasn't until then that I realised what a great reputation he had in the community. Like the local mayor was there and everything. What a great reputation. And he was just a very honest man and had a reputation for it. So I was brought up in that kind of environment, and my family life was great. The ecclesia I was brought up in was probably the most conservative, or one of the most conservative ecclesias in Sydney. Okay. And as I think you probably already know from previous people that you've interviewed, Australia historically...
Did you have a blue suit?
I did, yes. And Australia
you were in a blue suit ecclesia.
Yeah, Australia historically was polarised into two main groups, very conservative, and those on the other side were, I wouldn't call them liberal, but they were more progressive. And Australia was strictly divided. And those two groups of ecclesias had almost no contact with each other when I was growing up.
And are you referring to Logos and Shield?
Yes.
Okay.
So I was brought up in a Logos ecclesia. And my wife was brought up in a Shield ecclesia. And,
Romeo and Juliet over here.
So quite different. So I was brought up in that environment. And there were some people in the ecclesia who were very strict about things like Christmas. You wouldn't celebrate Christmas, and wouldn't even celebrate birthdays, some of them and so on. Our family was not like that at all. We celebrated Christmas, and we had a Christmas tree. And if we had if there was a visiting speaker from Adelaide or something that came and visited, my father wouldn't hide the TV. We knew other people that would hide.
Yeah, I heard about people hiding the Christmas tree too.
Oh, right. Yeah. No, we didn't do that. My father was, he had a view on it, and he wasn't ashamed of it. And so, no, we celebrate Christmas in our family and so on. So we were kind of a progressive family in a very conservative ecclesia.
Yeah, it sounds like he wasn't just fitting into the mold. He was kind of living according to his own conscience. And also, I'll just say, I don't think I remember any other Christadelphian having a funeral like that with such a large attendance from people outside of the ecclesia. So that's very impressive. And I think says a lot about his character already to hear some of these stories about your dad.
After my father passed away, for weeks or a few months after he passed away, there would be people that would come to my mother and just give us some money and say, "Oh, my dad had loaned them some money," and they just paying it back. Or my father, he was a businessman, and sometimes if people couldn't afford to get work done, he would just say, "Just pay me when you can." And so a lot of these people turned up after, and it wasn't until then that I realised just how really generous he'd been with all these people that, if people needed work done, he would just do it and just say, "Pay me when you can." Oh, I can remember at one stage, for example, we ate a lot of rabbit.
Okay.
And I found out later the reason for it was that there was someone that needed some work done. My dad did it for him. And they just said, "Pay me when you can." And the guy would just go out and shoot rabbits. And because he didn't have much
He was
money.
like a hunter. Yeah.
He would bring rabbits.
Okay.
I guess around Sydney in the rural areas, rabbits are a curse. So they were plentiful, but that was how he paid it back. So Dad was happy with that. I'll accept rabbits as payment.
Yeah, this is like an old bartering system.
Yeah, but it was just like that. He would just help people if they needed help.
Yeah.
Loan people money if they needed it. And I think that goes back to his dad in business as well during the Depression. Would give people work, even if he didn't need them to do work. He would just say, "Oh, can you drive a truck?" And they go, "Yeah, okay, I need someone to drive a truck on a Friday." And if he didn't really need them, he would just give people work. So my dad, I think, grew up in that environment as well. But my dad's dad was religious, and his dad and so on. So, there's generations have been very religious, but not Christadelphian.
Yeah, it sounds like there's a lot of character building that was passed down generation to generation. And perhaps as important as their religious views, since just the way he lived his life according to his own principles, it sounds like. Because I know sometimes in Christadelphian communities, there's kind of pressure to live a certain way. And that also, I think, kind of relates to what characteristics you're going to show. Yeah.
So I was very grateful. I think I grew up in a family with a very strong ethic like that. It kind of related to their religion, but didn't come solely out of their religion. It was just... Yeah. I remember my dad's often I'd ask him questions about what you should do, but just do the right thing, and it wasn't like, just see what the Bible says or, make it fit in with some dogma. It was just do the, just do the right thing.
Yeah. I think that's a lot more about building character, than just, this is what the Bible says, just religion to guide your life. Very interesting. It already gives some insight into, I think, a unique experience of how you were raised. Tell me more about you growing up in the ecclesia. If you want to talk about Sunday school or what led up to your baptism, things like that.
Well, I was born on a Sunday. My mum was a Sunday school teacher. Oh, yeah, we're special. Yeah.
Yes,
my mum was a Sunday school teacher. So I was 1 week old and I went to Sunday school because my mum had to be there. Too. Yeah. And I think, so my life began going to meetings at least 3 times a week from when I was a week old. Yeah, I remember starting to read books by Robert Roberts and John Thomas when I was 11 or 12.
Wow, that's really young.
And I can remember that because I remember in school, I don't know about in the US, but in Australia, it was compulsory to have 1 period a week in school of scripture.
No, we never had that, which I could see happening, but we don't currently have.
Right, yeah. I'm not sure whether they still do it now. But it was compulsory, and the local ministers, priests, whatever would come in, or people representing the church would come in and teach scripture for one period a week, and to do that. And because I was the only Christadelphian in school, there was no scripture class for me, so I had to go to the headmaster or the principal's office and sit outside his office during that scripture period. But he said it's a scripture period, so if you're going to sit there, you've got to read something religious.
Okay, well, at least that's broad enough. Yeah.
Which is fair enough. So I think the first religious book I read was The Ways of Providence by Robert Roberts.
Okay.
And then after that I read My Days and My Ways, his autobiography.
I read that one.
And then Dr. Thomas, His Life and Work, which is written by Robert Roberts. So the first 3 books I read were by Robert Roberts. Yep. And that was in primary school. So I must have been 11, 12 when I started to read those. And by the time I was baptised, by the time I was a teenager, I'd read Elpis Israel, Eureka, almost everything I get my hands on by John Thomas. It's probably no exaggeration to say I've probably read everything by John Thomas and Robert Roberts.
Can I ask, what was some of your impressions? Any favorites? Anything that stuck out to you that you remember? Because, Robert Roberts said he was reading like John Thomas's books and his magazine when he was like the same age. And I wonder, like, how much are you getting out of it compared to like when you read it later, for one thing?
Yeah.
At that age.
That's a good question. I haven't really thought about how much I got out of it. I learned a lot about Christadelphian dogma.
Okay, good place for it.
Yeah, I read Eureka, all 3 volumes, and I was young when I read it, and it was difficult going. And I remember being really disappointed that I was hoping this book would make sense of Revelation, and at the end of it, after the end of 3 volumes, it still made no sense. And so it was like a lot of words, and they went off on a lot of tangents and explained, things about dogma, but still did not explain Revelation in a way that made sense to me.
Okay, interesting. All right.
Yeah, and as a result of having questions about that, that's eventually what got me into trouble with Logos Christadelphians.
That's how it starts.
Because I had questions. That's one thing I did learn about Christadelphians. Don't ask questions. So you just accept it.
Or at least ones that aren't scripted, because I remember getting like little packets where it's like, here's a question someone should ask you, and then Bible mark this, and then a link to this page, and it would give you like a little guidebook to use. But I was like, it's like, you're only supposed to ask those questions. Any of the other ones, they don't really want you to ask. Yeah.
I can remember on Sunday evening lectures, it was a kind of a standard way to end lectures by saying, we don't want you to just take what we say, take our word for it. We want you to go home, read the Bible, find it the truth for yourself, and come back and ask questions or something.
That's like their tagline, yeah.
It's a tagline, but it's completely untrue. Because they don't want you to find things for yourself, and if you start asking questions,
then
you're out the door.
Usually.
Yeah, exactly. So I discovered that fairly early too, that simply was not true at all. Yeah. But I was baptised when I was 15, almost 16.
Oh. Okay, you're on the younger side, I think.
Yeah, I think in Australia that's young. I wanted to be baptised when I was about 13, 14. And spoke to my parents about it, and I had to speak to the examining brother in the ecclesia to say that. And then his thing was the examining brother in our ecclesia was actually my uncle, so he'd known me all my life. But still, the rule was you had to prepare for baptism. I had to go to his place once a fortnight for a year and a half.
Wow!
While I would sit there and listen to him explain to me Christadelphian doctrine, which almost put me to sleep because I'd been hearing the lectures since I was a week old. So I knew it all, and he knew that I knew it all. You'd already read
all these books,
and he knew that because he was my uncle. I mean, he knew the family I was brought up in, but I still had to do that.
Wow. I didn't have to do that. I didn't have to take those courses. I just had to take the exam.
Yeah, wow. What was really frustrating for me was I had been persuaded by a prominent speaker in Sydney that Jesus was about to return, and he'd worked out the date. What year it was going to be.
Do you remember the date?
I don't remember the exact date. The year was 1971. I've given away my age, so it was 1971, and he'd convinced me that Jesus would return in 1971. So this was probably 1970, and I wanted to be baptized, and I had to go through this very slow process. And I kept thinking, hurry up, because 1971 is almost here, and I'm going to miss out. And then as it turned out, by the time I'd gone through all this, it was 1972, and Jesus still hadn't come. And I was actually relieved that Jesus hadn't come because I was worried that I wasn't going to be accepted. Yeah. I remember I discussed it with Mum and Dad, and they were saying, oh, look, it doesn't matter whether you're baptized or not. Jesus, it's what's in your heart, But still, I had this thing.
That's nice of them to say. Not every Christadelphian parent's going to say that.
and that's not the message that was coming through loud and clear on Sundays and things.
Exactly.
So my parents were actually quite out of sync with the ecclesia on a lot of things.
Yeah, did they not know that there were other ecclesias around?
No, I think it was my father. His brother was there, and his mum was there, and whatever. So there was family reasons why he was there, and they'd been there since the ecclesia started and all that kind of stuff. So and he didn't see a good reason to leave. But, and I think also he thought he was probably a good influence against extremism. So whatever he was there, they wouldn't become ultra extreme. But I
Hopefully.
don't think that really worked for him. But anyway, I can remember another thing about my dad. Well, it just shows a bit about how he was out of sync. We'd be driving home from meetings on Sunday morning, and my dad would be singing hymns in the car that were out of the Church of Christ hymn book, which was what he was brought up in.
Ooh.
He was brought up Church of Christ, which is like the Disciples of Christ in the US.
Mm-hmm.
And they're called Churches of Christ here. Campbellites, to use John Thomas's language.
Yeah, they're all
My dad had
related.
been brought up in that. And the fact that he used to sing, the old rugged cross and all this kind of stuff out of the Church of Christ hymnals on the way home from meetings, I think told him at an early age that there was something about that he really missed, and he wasn't getting with the Christadelphians. Yeah. Yeah.
And that culture stuck with him to a degree, that little bit.
Yeah. His parents became Christadelphians when he was a teenager, so he had that Church of Christ background.
Interesting. And very interesting to hear about how stressful it was leading up to your baptism. Of like, Jesus is coming, like, hurry up.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then tell me a little bit about your involvement with the church after you were baptized. Did you give exhortations and classes while you were there?
Yeah, so I was fully involved from an early age. So I was 15, 16. I don't remember when I gave my first exhortation, but I would have been quite young, maybe 17 or something.
Yeah, like a teen still. Yeah.
Yeah, I would definitely tell still a teen. And was giving exhortations, Bible classes, lectures on various committees. I was very, very actively involved. I remember, Richie and I can remember bringing along friends from school. One of my school teachers became a Christadelphian.
Wow. Wait, how'd that happen?
I'm not taking any credit for that, but because I think he'd got a leaflet in his letterbox from a different local ecclesia or something at some stage.
Okay.
And he must have known I was a Christadelphian because he used to come to me at school sometime with questions, and in the breaks and things would ask me questions about things. And then I remember taking him along to our meeting. And so anyway, I was, I think very actively involved in meetings pretty much from the time I was baptised, got involved in things. And then eventually, as things evolved, I used to speak at Bible schools and Bible weeks, or go interstate and speak at ecclesias for study weekends and all those sorts of things.
Okay, so you got asked to do the bigger stuff, like on the circuit and travel around?
Yeah, definitely. I was on the circuit, yeah.
What were some of the places you traveled to outside of Australia?
I didn't travel very much outside of Australia.
Okay.
It did some, kind of missionary work, but I don't, what they call missionary work and what the Christadelphian Bible mission calls missionary works. It's kind of like a paid holiday. People go on holidays to India or somewhere exotic, and they attend meetings and they come away feeling good because they've done their missionary work. But
basically like giving a guest exertation. Is that what you mean?
Yeah, exactly, that kind of stuff. So I did a little bit of that kind of stuff, but otherwise, within Australia, I mainly did quite a bit of speaking. In fact, somebody I went to school with, one of my friends from primary school, became a Uniting Church minister. The Uniting Church in Australia is a union of Methodist, Presbyterian and Congregational churches, and so his background was Methodist. And he became a minister. I remember one day, after school, we're just catching up in a pub over a beer. He was saying to me, so he says, one of the things I liked about Christadelphians is everyone's involved. He said, I wish I could get more of my lay people involved in the church. And so I liked it. So he said, how much do you do? How much speaking do you do? And I told him, in my mind, I just did a rough calculation as to what I was doing in that 3-month period, And he just turned to me with a stunned face and says, you do more preaching than I do, and I get paid for it.
Wow, that is pretty wild.
But that's the Christadelphian thing. If you're willing to do something, they really throw you in.
But you almost don't think about that, how much they mobilize their members to be preaching and be active and like running the meeting for free. It's just an interesting perspective when you compare it to paid clergy and learn about that difference.
Yeah. I think it's one of those things I think later on I came to resent. The fact that they make this claim on your time and expect you to do all this stuff, and your family and your work, all those other things are secondary or tertiary, and that the ecclesia comes first. And they make this huge claim on your time. They expect you to do all this teaching and whatever, if you're able to.
Yeah, especially for the men.
With no reward. I don't mean financial reward. I mean, just there's very few benefits.
Yeah. I mean, that's why I guess for some people it's almost like they get like fame if they're really good at it, like name recognition and more opportunities for travel or writing and publication, things like that. But that's really true. And that's something I've seen come up in the Facebook group a lot is it seems like the older people left, the more they have to grapple with how much time they put into it. And that's just a tough thing to realize when you realize your life is only so long and you gave so many hours to something that no longer provides meaning for you and whatever else you were getting out of it.
Yeah, in the final years before we left, we might have been in the stages of starting to drift away. But for some reason, I got an invitation to speak for a weekend in a Church of Christ in New Zealand. And so I went to New Zealand, spoke at this Church of Christ, and they paid my fare, but they also paid my wife. So my wife commented, she said, all the speaking I did for Christadelphians was interstate. They'd always pay my fare, like an airfare to go, but they never ever paid hers. So she would either stay home or I would pay. And we went there and they paid both fares. You know, that's different. And then we got there and the pastor at this church just gave me an envelope after I was there, and it was full of money. And I goes, what's this for? And he says, oh, that's your honorarium. They pay me as well to do it. But whereas with Christadelphians, there's this expectation that you would be there, and so I'm not expecting financial reward at all. But
yeah, you really didn't get as Christadelphian. I never heard of anyone getting like paid. It was only like, you know, lodging, travel, things like that for speakers that they were like bringing in. And
even then, as like my wife commented, it wasn't generous. It was like,
no,
she was expected to stay home.
I feel bad for some of these stories of the women. You're like, aw, hearing the difference between the men and the women.
Yeah. I mean, I didn't complain at the time because I didn't know there was any alternative or any better.
Yeah, that's how it always
whatever.
was. So it was normal. Okay.
And it wasn't until later I just realised how unappreciated I think I was.
Yeah. And then you had mentioned that you guys were from different groups in Christadelphia. So how did your paths lead you to each other? Can I ask you a little bit about that?
Yes, well, that was quite fortuitous because in my early 20s, I had some questions about Revelation. I had read Eureka, like I mentioned.
So much Eureka without having that Eureka moment.
Yeah, exactly. So I remember my grandfather was an avid reader. He was a Christadelphian. And I saw a book on his bookshelf one day that caught my attention, and it was on Revelation, and I started to read it. And then I asked him if I could borrow it. After he says, no, you can't. He said, I don't want you reading that book. And I go, but it's on your bookshelf. And he just says, oh, no, but it's not one you should read. And it was Revelation, a Biblical Approach by Harry Whittaker.
Oh.
You know.
We had Harry Whittaker on another episode, and he got someone else in trouble, is all I'm saying.
Oh, right. Well, yeah. Anyway, it was a completely different approach. It was really fresh. And I'd never heard anything like this at all.
Wow.
And I was just curious to read more. Anyway, my grandfather wouldn't lend me his, but I tracked it down. I bought a copy from someone, and I read it, and I read it again, and I read it again, because this is just so different to anything I've heard of before.
And probably easier to read than John Thomas.
Yeah, it was definitely easy to read, but also it was just very refreshing to think there is another way of looking at things. You know, it doesn't have to be John Thomas's way. And it kind of made sense. And I wouldn't say I agreed with what he said, but it certainly raised a lot of questions for me. So we had a speaker in our ecclesia who is regarded as a Revelation expert. I mean, he taught the Bible classes on Revelation and stuff. So I went to him one Sunday morning between Sunday school and the memorial meeting in that break where you have coffee, and I just said, I've got a couple of questions. And I wasn't being confrontational or argumentative.
Well,
I just
that would
had a
be
couple
who
of questions.
you should go up to, right? Yeah, like he wants to talk Revelation. He knows all about it. Let's chat. Okay.
So I asked a couple of questions, and then only 5 minutes in the conversation, he says, what have you been reading? So I just said, oh, well, I've been reading Revelation, but I've also been, and I told him I read Eureka, but I'd also read this book by Harry Whittaker. Sometime during the following week, I was told I had to attend a meeting of the Arranging Brethren for them to examine me on my views on Revelation. And as a result of that, I didn't have views on Revelation. I just had a bunch of questions.
You had questions, yeah. And remember, they want you to go home and read your Bible and come back with questions, right? As we said earlier. Is that what you're supposed to do? And now we're like in detention.
Yeah. Well, as a result of that, I had to be questioned Interrogated is a proper
Yeah, interrogated is the word that comes to mind.
That wasn't how they phrased it, but that was the reality. By
Oh, no.
by two brethren, including this expert on Revelation, it was a Sunday afternoon. I think it was every second Sunday, and that went on for about a year.
Are you kidding me?
My father came with me because he said, "You're not going alone."
Good on him.
Dad was supportive.
He's great.
He didn't weigh in on any of the arguments. My dad would sit there and, sometimes he'd make some comment about, "What are you asking that?" But
he's like your lawyer there. He's just like,
yeah, yeah. No, my dad was a great bloke. Yeah. Anyway, this went on for a long, long time. Well, I say, from my recollection it was about a year. It could have been longer, but it was about a year. And in the end, they started to put some restrictions on me. Like, okay, you can't teach Sunday school, you can't do this, you can't do something else until we find out what your views are. And I kept saying, I don't have views. I'm trying to work this out. But it's like, but you read Eureka, you know what it's about.
Ooh, John Thomas only allowed here. Only one interpretation allowed. Wow. Yeah. And also, it could have been a discussion the whole time. Like, it could have been you guys having a conversation and just, like, hashing out ideas and being like, okay, interesting perspective. Yeah. But instead, it was just trying to shut you down and get you to conform. It just feels like they were putting the pressure on you.
So as a result, I started to visit some other ecclesias.
Mm-hmm. Understandable.
And I started to visit some shield ecclesias. I couldn't tell anyone at the meeting I was at that I was doing that because that was a definite no-no. You shouldn't go there at all because these people didn't understand the Bible and, they used to say terrible things about the shield ecclesias and about these people.
I also feel like they'd be mad you skipped detention here too.
Yeah. And I remember when I was going there, thinking, these people do read the Bible. These people do understand.
I mean, they're Christadelphians. They're reading their Bibles.
And they're not different at all in terms of their beliefs, but they are different in a lot of their attitudes. They were willing to discuss things. And I remember going there and saying, I had some questions about Revelation. I said, I used to speak to brother so-and-so. He's written a book on Revelation. And so you go and think, there's another view on Revelation. So, they were much more open to that. And so I decided to leave. I just left the ecclesia I was at and joined another ecclesia, which was a definite no-no because you can't leave. We haven't finished questioning you yet. And I go, well, I have left, and I've joined somewhere else. And then they started writing letters to the ecclesia that I joined and saying he can't join because we were giving him permission to leave. And they go, well, he has joined. And they said we've interviewed him before, and we're fine with what he's whatever. So, but the ecclesia left. It took them about a year after that, and they eventually disfellowshipped me, which didn't mean anything because
you already left
somewhere else. But they just couldn't let it go. They had to do that.
I have heard about a few people in the Facebook group where they said like they put in their resignation and people would be like, we don't accept it. And then they would disfellowship them to like get the last word. And I was like, oh my gosh, this is so petty. But I'm glad you left.
And I did leave. And my wife didn't belong to that ecclesia, but she belonged to that group of ecclesia. She was brought up in a Shield ecclesia. And in fact, I think one of her forebears was baptised by John Bell, who was the first editor of the Shield magazine and had met Robert Roberts and whatever. So I say she's Christadelphian royalty. But so with these sorts of connections. But so I was in my early 20s, so I was part of the youth group, and so was she, and that's where I met my wife. So
that's what I was figuring once you got into the youth group kind of thing.
And made friends there. It was great. It was a great experience for me in joining a bunch of ecclesias that were much more progressive and open-minded.
It's interesting to contrast the experiences because I don't know a ton of people who have been in both. I was only really in one my whole time, so I couldn't really contrast it with a lot of others. And also just being in America, I didn't see as much of a spectrum. Whereas now learning about ecclesias in Australia and in the UK, I'm becoming more aware of a much broader spectrum. And so it's definitely changing my interpretations because now I'm hearing about ones that are way more conservative than what I saw and way more like progressive than what I saw. So I feel like all of the ones I was in were very similar and we didn't have so much of that dynamic. So definitely interesting to hear about and see the difference it made on you. I mean, you were really educated and learning so much in that one environment, but it just sounds like emotionally and for growth, it wasn't really a great fit there for as you're getting older and having
Mm.
more questions and continue to pursue intellectually all of the stuff around theology. But let's keep going with your story. So tell me what happens next as you continued your experience in the Christadelphians.
My wife and I were members of various ecclesias throughout our Christadelphian life. We moved around. I moved to Melbourne for a couple of years at one stage, and in fact, was in the same ecclesia as Rob, who you interviewed earlier.
Yes.
And
Yep.
so Rob and I became friends from that experience because we were in that ecclesia. It was a nice ecclesia. We belonged to different ecclesias, not because we were kind of dissatisfied and kept moving, but mainly because we moved. Physically, we were relocated, and so we had experiences of a kind of a range of different styles of ecclesias and so on. And where we ended up, the last ecclesia we were in was probably on the other end of the spectrum compared to. I was brought up in one of the most conservative ecclesias in the country, and ended up on one of the most progressive or liberal ecclesias in the country, where they would have women speakers and so on. That. So I experienced the full spectrum.
Yeah, all of it. That's so cool. I never saw a woman exhort in my whole life.
Well, at that ecclesia, they had a very healthy attitude, I thought, to women. Women could speak, but they also, instead of having arranging brethren, they had ministers. People were appointed to a ministry role if they had talents in that particular area. So if someone was really good with kids, they became the children's minister and would look after the children's program. If someone was really good with music, they might become the music minister and they'd look after the organising the music for a Sunday and things like that. And
that makes the most sense. It's a meritocracy instead of what it typically is.
And we were at that ecclesia for a few years, and as part of that time I was the teaching minister. I would look after organising the teaching on Sundays and so on. So I didn't do all the teaching, but I would organise.
Yeah, organising.
So they had a ministry team, and that ministry didn't care whether you're male or female, but it was what your skills were. So I thought that was a very healthy approach.
Yeah, yeah. I think that sounds like a good model, that people could learn from. Sure.
Yeah, women were fully involved in everything, so that was very healthy. And that was the last ecclesia we were in.
Yeah, except you did eventually leave, so...
Yeah, and we didn't make a decision overnight to leave.
I find it rarely happens that way.
Right. And I don't remember what might have triggered it in the first place.
Really? Huh.
Yeah. Well, I can remember some of the issues that were involved. I can remember this. I became very concerned because I kind of thought this ecclesia in many ways is so un-Christadelphian, but there are certain core traits there that are very Christadelphian. Like you cannot get away from certain things. And one of the things that I found that was this tendency to be divisive. Like with Christadelphians, you have to take a stand for it or against it. But you have to take a stand on everything.
Yep. That's why there's
I remember
so many
there was
splits.
a couple in this ecclesia that were going through some marriage problems, and the marriage was ending. And they're both members of the ecclesia. And it was kind of expected, so whose side are you on? I was like, what, do I have to take a side? And it's like
it's their business. Come on.
And it's kind of, I'm thinking, well, okay, there's a couple that's struggling. I can remember having this conversation with one of the other people in the ministry team one stage, saying, if a couple are having a problem, then the rest of the church should really be helping the couple.
Yeah, support
not taking
them.
Sides. And it's kind of like, you kind of have to take sides. And I'm thinking, no, I'm not. But they assumed I would take one particular side because the man in that couple was a good friend and whatever. Yeah. And they just assumed I would take his side. And I didn't like that. I didn't like people making assumptions for me.
They're both members, though. They're both on your team.
Yeah. I didn't like that the people would make assumptions about where we would stand on things. And that
it sounds like put a little pressure on you, too.
Oh, yeah. It became very... I mean, a marriage breakup is always nasty. It's always horrible, I think, or mostly.
I don't think it's ever usually very easy and neat. I don't think.
No. So it was a tough time for them, but also for the whole ecclesia, the whole church. It was really a tough time for all of them in lots of ways. So I guess it got to the point where we found it was really uncomfortable going. I remember going one Sunday morning, and they had this meeting had another nice practice, I thought, was when you get there, they give you a slip of paper if you've got a prayer request, and that would go to one of the people who were praying that morning, and they would have these slips on what people's prayer requests were, and they would pray for them.
Yeah, I've never heard that at Christadelphian ecclesia, but I've seen that at other churches.
Yeah. And so this was something that this meeting had, which I thought was a nice thing. And we found it awkward that sometimes we'd go there and there'd be prayer requests to pray for one of the people in this couple, pray for, so-and-so because she's going to be having a very hard time tomorrow, like on Monday. And I thought, I know why she's having a hard time. She's taking her ex-husband to court to get custody of the kids, and so he wouldn't see them. Why don't we pray for him too? He's going to have a hard time as well. Mm-hmm. And I just thought, this is, whether I'm right or wrong, I thought, this is typical Christadelphian stuff. Like you take a stand for or against something, and someone's right or they're wrong.
It also feels like enmeshment, almost like a toxic family dynamic where people aren't really individuals. They aren't acting really maturely, and they're just kind of infighting and causing drama amongst themselves instead of building each other up and trying to have like this common goal they're reaching towards and creating a healthy system. I feel like a psychologist would have some things to say about that dynamic, but I agree. I've definitely seen that in a broader Christadelphian culture. That's something that is very common.
Yeah.
So I could see that being a reason where it's like, I just don't want to be around that. I don't want them to ask me that on Sunday. I don't want to talk about it. I just need some distance.
Yeah. There was one particular person that me and on Sunday, we would be walking past each other and he would always turn away and we didn't make eye contact. And I think it's related to this. I don't know. He would never told me what the problem was.
And it just became very out of character.
And I think it's kind of like, what have I said wrong, whatever. I think it's maybe just the position I'd taken. Whatever, not taking a position was the wrong position. So this became really uncomfortable for us. So Sunday morning would come by and was just like, we don't feel like going. So we didn't go. We might have stayed home or we started to visit other churches.
Okay. You were very active with that. You're like, I'm not feeling happy here. I'm going to keep moving. Like, I think a lot of people have gone right towards atheism where they're like, this church isn't for me. But you're like, let's find another church, which is interesting to hear. Because
at this stage, I hadn't lost faith in God. I definitely had lost faith in the church.
Yeah.
And I thought the church is not what it's meant to be. You go to all these Bible classes on the Song of Solomon. The Song of Solomon is all about Christ and the church. And you're thinking, but the church is not like that. Or whatever the way they were describing it. It's like you're describing the church as something that's really ideal and get these exhortations from Ephesians about, the bride of Christ and all that. But it's not like that. It's in some ways it's very toxic. It's awful.
Mm-hmm. It certainly can be, yeah. And it sounds like they were heading in the right direction, but yes, some of these hiccups they still hadn't quite ironed out for a really healthy ecclesia.
Yeah, I think I probably should have realised that much earlier when I was kind of booted out of the first ecclesia I grew up in. I should have realised then that there was something fundamentally wrong, but. The
other thing is, I feel like it's harder if you're born into it because that's all you ever knew. And I'm sure it felt like a breath of fresh air just going to the other meeting that was less strict. So it was stepping stones out.
Yeah.
But I think it would be hard to be like, it's this fundamental problem, this overarching thing. When you're like in it, I feel like it's harder to get the big picture too.
Yeah. Yeah.
And you don't have a lot of perspective like you do now with a lot more lived experience.
Yeah. We kept going because we thought it would be good for our kids. We have 3 daughters, and they were teenagers at the time, and we thought, we should hang in there. They actually decided to stop going at one point. They just said there was no one there their age, and they said the meeting wasn't really supporting their needs or providing for their needs. They had a lot of younger kids in this meeting.
Yeah.
And it was really focused on that. I organised things for them as teenagers, whatever. And I thought, but I organised things at home.
Yeah, so, exactly.
Yeah. And in there, they just stopped going. And then we thought, well, why are we still going? So we kind of drifted away. And so my wife and I looked at other churches and things like that. And I don't remember actually resigning from one particular day saying, okay, that's it, we're leaving. I think we just drifted away and stopped going.
Do you remember what churches you were visiting?
Oh, yeah, we visited kind of a variety. We didn't go every Sunday to a church. We didn't feel like we had to go to church on Sunday, but we're the biggest church in Sydney and maybe in Australia at the time, and maybe still is Hillsong Church, which has a reputation internationally.
Yeah.
Mainly because they provide a lot of music. It was a mega church, so you had to go there because that was...
Get the experience.
and it was really refreshing in lots of ways.
Okay.
You know, it was totally different from anything we'd experienced as Christadelphians. My wife didn't like it so much, but I kind of liked it. It was so totally different. I found it very refreshing, but you know, eventually, you find out it's also toxic. And my wife doesn't like crowds at all.
Yeah, I could see that being a turn-off.
Going to church with 5,000 members on a Sunday morning is not appealing. So,
well, at least they're not going to get into your marriage drama when you have that many people.
yeah. So, yeah. Although you hear stories that if you're really involved in the church, then they do get, it's when you're really involved. But if you just go in, part of the crowd they don't know.
Yeah. If you're in the anonymous crowd, but if you're like hardcore, okay.
Yeah. And there's been several television programs here about people who have left that church and talk about the toxicity that's there. I'm thinking, oh yeah, okay, it's everywhere.
Yeah.
Any big any organisation, big or small, there's something toxic about being institutionalised. Yeah.
Yeah, it's not uncommon, unfortunately.
Yeah, so we left Christadelphians sort of progressively, drifted away, looking for something else. We found a house church that was not far from where we lived by a bunch of people that were not Christadelphians, but they had a lot of beliefs very, very much that were similar to Christadelphians. They were loosely connected with the Church of God of the Abrahamic Faith in America, which was
that makes sense.
Group Benjamin Wilson, who wrote translated the Dialogue and knew John Thomas, and I think John Thomas got a lot of ideas from him because he was John Thomas's neighbour when they both lived in Illinois at some stage, or they had farms in the same vicinity.
This episode is actually going to come out shortly after an episode with someone from that group, so that's a great tie-in.
Oh, cool, yeah. I got interested in that group, and I went to the US at one stage and met up with some people from the group, and I was in touch with someone, still am, with someone who was historian for that group, and I was very much interested in the connections between Christadelphians and the Church of God and their origins, and thought these people like Benjamin Wilson must broke away from Christadelphians or whatever, and go, no, it's the other way around. I say Benjamin Wilson, all these people they were there teaching. John Thomas went to their meetings, got some ideas, and then started something of his own. It's kind of like it was the direction of influence was in the other direction. Yeah. So, but I found this group in Sydney that was not formally part of that church at all, and they were lovely. We went there. It was a home meeting, and we went there for quite a few years. And it was just a lovely group, and they were mostly family. And we went there for quite a while. And the only reason we stopped going was because we eventually moved out of the area. I mean, it was just too far away for us to travel. But yeah, it was lovely.
Yeah, I'd be curious to hear from the historian, because like you said, that angle of like who learned from who, I would also find really fascinating. And I'd be curious what resources he looks at for that kind of thing too, because I don't know as much about COGAF.
Yeah, something I learned about John Thomas, because I've read so much of his stuff over the years, and I was quite familiar with his style of writing and so on. I did learn that he was a plagiarist. He got almost all of his ideas from somebody else. But I guess that's okay, because we all get ideas from someone else.
It's not wrong if you credit it and you build on it. Okay.
Yeah.
But someone wasn't very good at crediting things.
Yeah, John Thomas would quote huge slabs from somebody.
Yeah,
and
like
then
verbatim.
denigrate that person, So, it's kind of just
taking
all his stuff.
Yeah. And that's why even in the John Thomas episode and almost every episode since, I talk about how he was reading all of these different people. And that's never in the main narrative. It's always, he came up with everything himself. He didn't read anything else. It's just the Bible. And it's like, nope.
It's nonsense.
It's not true. And it doesn't even logically make sense. You're like that. Who can even be in such a bubble like that? It's not even just realistic. But at the same time, you read any of his works and you see all these different things he mentions having read and owning or whatever. And he was quite well read. Yeah.
In fact, if you look at all the major Christadelphian beliefs, none of them are original to Christadelphians. They've all come from somewhere else. My father, as I say, was brought up in the Church of Christ, but my father and his parents left the church even before they became Christadelphians. They were part of a church that believed pretty much almost exactly the same as Christadelphians.
Mm-hmm.
And Christadelphians had heard about this church, and the local Christadelphians met up with them, and that's how my father and his parents became Christadelphians. So that was kind of like, we believe this already, so. So there's been other groups, and I think they may have had a connection with groups like the Church of God in the US, but there were similar groups in Scotland, where my grandfather came from, that believed that as well. And I think historically they probably had these connections going back a long way. So,
Quite
but
possibly.
there's a lot of Christadelphian beliefs about being Unitarian. That's not new. Believing in the mortality of the soul. That's not new. Not believing in a supernatural devil. That's not new. The Christadelphians got all this from someone else, from other places. The only thing I think where Christadelphians may have been a bit unique was in they have a kind of a unique understanding of the atonement.
Okay.
And that was because if you take these views, if you're a Unitarian and there's no devil and there's no mortal soul, you've got to kind of come up with, well, so why did Jesus die? And when you put all those things together, you've got to come up with a kind of fairly unique answer to that question, why did Jesus have to die? And so Christadelphians, maybe that's where they might be unique, is their unique view of the atonement. But the most divisive subjects amongst Christadelphians, where there be the most divisions, it's the atonement. So Christadelphians can't even agree on that themselves. And it's because the Christadelphian views on the atonement fundamentally don't make sense at all. And that's why they're so divisive, because they do not make sense.
Because it's kind of like forcing something to fit that doesn't naturally fit, you think? Like just not a strong enough explanation that they provide for their beliefs?
Yeah, well, a lot of Christadelphian dogma is based on the writings of Robert Roberts, and on the atonement, it's the blood of Christ and the slain lamb, the two things he wrote, which go there. In the blood of Christ, he goes page after page after page without a single reference to Scripture. Because the views, he's trying to base it logically. And in the end, it's like, so why does God have to kill his own son for the sins of the world? And it's kind of, because it's required, because there has to be a sacrifice. So who requires this? And it's like, God does. And so this is kind of like, so God has to do something because he himself has already decided he requires this. And so that's just kind of circular reasoning.
That logic's pretty weak. Yeah, circular reasoning,
and then
just going around and around.
Roberts calls this, I think he must have known this is illogical. So he coins a term. He says it's the divine etiquette.
What?
What does that mean?
That's not a thing.
It's not. And this is, he's got this whole section in the blood of Christ. It's called the divine etiquette.
God needs blood. That's the etiquette.
Yeah. Who says God needs blood? Oh, God says. So
oh, man.
God is doing this to meet his own requirements. And it's like, but why does God require it? The whole thing is totally illogical.
Isn't he all powerful?
Yeah. So anyway, it fails the biblical test because he goes page after page without quoting the Bible. But it fails the logic test as well in my mind. And that's the only area I think where Christadelphians may be unique in their unique understanding of the atonement. But no. But it's not completely unique because it's still influenced by a whole lot of other stuff,
Sure.
The whole argument in Australia, the whole reason for the division in Australia for generations between Logos and Shield was based on an argument about a definition of what of clean flesh and whether there is a propensity within a human being to sin or not. That whole argument's it's based on like Augustine and original sin, but they've just changed the words, but it's the same argument. They've had it. So anyway,
yeah, it's definitely been interesting for me even leaving and hearing about other people's beliefs, and sometimes being so surprised at how common my beliefs were as a Christadelphian to people in completely different religions. So it's definitely been eye-opening to see how much overlap there was when we were taught we were so unique and we're going to be persecuted because we're so, special as God's people with this divisive, special truth that we know. So it was definitely interesting to be like, oh, well, they're kind of similar.
Yeah.
Kind of undermined a little bit to see how similar we are to plenty of other groups. So let's keep going with your story.
Yeah, and I don't remember whether we officially left or not, but we just, in our minds, we'd left.
Okay,
we'd gone.
so by that point, we're gone. Okay,
yeah,
all right.
Yeah, so and it was after that we found this other group. For a while, we went nowhere, and we found this other group, and we started to go to their meetings, and that was good. And we left them just because we moved out of the area, but and we didn't go looking for anywhere else because I'd lost faith in church generally. That group was a home meeting. I wasn't going to look for another home meeting. I wasn't going to start one or anything like that.
And it was very similar to Christadelphians still, so it sounds like you finally started to step away from some of that.
It was similar to Christadelphians in terms of their core doctrines, but in terms of their culture, it was nothing like Christadelphians at all. I mean,
Okay.
it was a home meeting. It was all very informal
Yeah.
and all this kind of thing. And it was, in terms of that culture, was different. So we found it very refreshing. Yeah, we found it was nice. They were also very open to, exploring different ideas and things like that as well, so that they weren't kind of restricted. And I was exploring different ideas, on
And you mentioned you're
theological
exploring,
things.
went back to college around that time, didn't you? To university?
Yeah, my wife and I both went back to university in 2011. We'd always talked about in our retirement we'd go back to university and just pursue some interests. Just sort of not going to do career stuff. We just do interest stuff. And then, for a variety of reasons, this is long before I'd retired. Well, I haven't really retired, so so I'm kind of semi-retired now. But this was before. But we thought, because of a variety of circumstances, in 2000 we decided we'd both go back to university. And I thought, okay, we'll go. I'll just do it. Pursue an interest, do a degree. We'll be there for 3 years, and then I'll go back to the kind of work I was doing before. So it just wasn't really. It was just taking a break out of life, actually,
kind of for fun.
3 years.
Yeah,
kind of for fun. And in the first semester, I actually couldn't get my timetable to work for me to get into the units that I needed to do that were prerequisites for what I wanted to do.
Oh, yeah, you have to start the prereqs, yeah.
So I just had to fill in a couple gaps on my timetable with doing some other electives stuff. And I saw they offered biblical Hebrew and biblical studies. And I thought, I was always interested in Hebrew. I did a year of Hebrew when I was in my early 20s.
Really?
I did go to...
My goodness.
Actually, this was still when I was in a Logos ecclesia, and they were very much against going to university.
Ooh, really?
It was kind of like, you shouldn't go to university.
Although there are people with master's degrees in my ecclesia.
Well, in these ecclesias, it was like, oh no, it's a bad environment. You'll end up believing all sorts of things.
You'll learn too much is the secret code they're underwriting what they're saying.
Yeah, it's a bad culture. You'll end up believing the Trinity and go on drugs, or whatever. So,
Wow.
So it was very much discouraged. It wasn't prohibited, very much discouraged for getting university. I wanted to go. Mm-hmm. I took a gap year, just a year where I did something. And then in the second year out of high school, I went to university part-time. And I didn't really talk about it. My family obviously knew, but I didn't really talk about the fact that I was going there. But I did. That's what I was doing. I did Hebrew and ancient history, and I was going to do biblical studies. I wanted to do it, and
okay,
anyway,
so that was kind of a long interest you had already had.
It was a long interest, yeah. And I didn't pursue that after, because the question kept coming up: what are you going to do with this for a career? And I thought, I needed to do something that was going to be a career.
Practical,
and so I left university. And I went to a different college and got different qualification, and which was for my career. And so it was kind of in my mind at some stage. I was always there, an interest in Hebrew, and was always, so when I saw this on the program, I thought, I had a smattering of Hebrew. I thought, I wouldn't mind going back and doing that.
Really
and biblical
getting
studies.
Into it.
I thought I'll just do that, and I'll just do 1 or 2 units until I can get this timetable to work better for me, and I'll pursue what I'm really interested in. But I fell in love with it. Their approach to biblical studies was so... I was arrogant about it. I thought, this will be easy. I've been going...
I've been reading
Bible multiple times. You're going to ever,
Yeah. I believe
since I was a week old. I know the Bible. I thought, this will be easy. I'll just breeze through this. It wasn't easy. But
what was the approach? Why was it so different?
I went to the University of Sydney, which is a secular university. It's has no church affiliations whatsoever. And in fact, it's in their charter that they can't teach theology or divinity because it's a secular university. They can teach biblical studies. So it's a secular approach. It's reading the Bible as literature. Like the Bible is a book.
Okay, yeah.
It's been around for a long time.
No emotional, eternal investment risk in there, any of that.
So the approach to the Bible is, let's work out who wrote it and when
that's a good place to start.
and why.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So...
and what's the significance of it? What's the cultural impact? What does this tell you about when it was written? All that kind of stuff like I did with essays in English class.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So, what was going on in the rest of the world at the time?
What might have influenced this? Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
I can definitely see how that's just so different than what a Christadelphian would think about relating to the Bible.
Yeah. So that became my major. I dropped what I was going to do and I just did Hebrew and biblical studies and Jewish studies. That was my major in the end. Did well at it, and so then did it for an extra year to get to do honours, and after that said you should do a PhD. So I thought, okay, I'll do a PhD.
Wow, that's a big change from just a couple classes.
So yeah, exactly. But this does happen. I've found with students that some people take it as an elective, and then they'll end up doing a PhD in it themselves. So it happens. People fall in love with it.
Yeah, I guess you never know until you dip your toes in and see what feels right.
Yeah. So my plan was to just do 3 years of uni and then go back to my old career, but it changed. I'm still there. So now
still at University of Sydney. That's so cool.
So, but went from being a student to a teacher. So
what a change. So fast. Yeah. But congratulations on that. Congrats on your PhD.
Oh, thank you. Yeah. Yeah, no, so I love it. I'm still very much involved with the Bible. I probably read the Bible more now than I did as a Christadelphian.
Okay, but do you use the Bible Companion?
No, absolutely not. That is the wrong way to read the Bible. That is definitely the wrong way to read the Bible.
Tell me why.
Well, to start off with, if you're going to read a book of the Bible, you've got to read a book of the Bible. You can't read a chapter today and one tomorrow and one whatever, because you miss it. If you want to understand a book, you've got to sit down and read it as a book.
Get into it. Yeah. Yeah,
read it over a couple of days or something, but read it as a book if you want to understand the book. Mm-hmm. And you can't also take sections from 3 parts of the Bible and then read them, because you don't get continuity or whatever. You get in smatterings of here and there, and it's all mixed up.
Yeah, you're all different time periods and authors and all this kind of stuff. Okay.
And also, you can't do. I've got to get through these 3 chapters today. But I need to go out later, or I want to watch something on TV. I have to get through my 3 chapters before whatever else is happening. And people you just skim read. Nothing's going in. It's much better to read, in my mind, 1 verse and think about it and pull it apart and research it than it is to read 3 chapters and get nothing out of it. Yeah, so
I absolutely agree, because having done the standard Christadelphian practice, I've definitely had days like that where I was like, I got to do my Bible readings. That's everyone's New Year's resolution. That's, what they tell you at the platform and youth weekends and stuff. They're like, get onto your readings, do your readings. But it becomes a chore. It becomes something you want to get through quickly. You're dredging yourself through these really difficult numbers and stuff where it's just on and on. It's like this many cubits in the temple. And I'm just like, oh, this is not doing it. So you're just skimming through and you're not getting anything. There's a pomegranate on the wall of the temple. Okay, I don't get anything out of that. But there are some really interesting chapters and verses where even when I see them out of context floating around the internet, I'm like, wait, that was in the Bible? So it is interesting. There's definitely things that you could really think about and get into. But the other thing is, I think you're almost reading, how there's rose-colored glasses? It's like Christadelphian glasses, where you're always looking for things that reiterate the stance and beliefs you already have, and maybe almost talk yourself down from questions that you have, because as you said, questions aren't always the most welcome. So you kind of got to figure it out and make sure you find a way to think about it that doesn't upset your existing beliefs, because you're reading the Bible because you want to be a good Christadelphian. You're not reading it to learn what the Bible says. Really.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
You have an agenda, basically.
For years of being a Christadelphian, there's always this criticism all the way through about other churches. They don't know anything about the Bible. They don't read it like we read it. We read the whole Bible every year and whatever. And these people don't know anything about the Bible. And it's simply not true. Mm-hmm. I know a lot of people in a lot of churches who know a lot about the Bible. And it's just, and they're not necessarily scholars, but there's a depth to scholarship that Christadelphians don't have. I remember when I did my PhD, it was on my main interest in the Hebrew Bible is humour and satire in the Bible.
Oh, and, that's fun.
So it is fun. There's a lot of humour in the Bible. But anyway,
okay, we're gonna need an episode on that too, please.
Okay. There's a lot of humour in the Bible. But so my PhD thesis was on reading the book of Jonah as satire, and I remember saying one day to one of my supervisors, I was just an anecdote. I was just saying, somebody asked me what I'm writing to do my PhD on, and I said, I'm writing about the book of Jonah. And he's like, what's the book of Jonah? I said, it's 2 pages of the Hebrew Bible. He says, 2 pages? That's really specific. And And my supervisor then said to me, "Oh yeah, you've got to get that down to be more specific." I said, "Yeah, down to 2 verses." And he said, "No, down to 2 words." And in the end, my PhD was on 2 words in the Book of Jonah. So,
are you kidding?
So this is, but what? this is biblical scholarship goes deep.
To that level, so micro level.
When Christadelphians say, "Oh, these people don't know anything about the Bible," it's like they spend 4 years on 2 words. I mean, it's not just those 2 words. There's obviously the whole context.
Yeah. So primarily, okay.
So you're thinking there is a depth to scholarship, which Christadelphians just dismiss. They just say it's not there. These people don't know anything about the Bible.
Or they don't agree with us, so we don't even want to regard it. We just disregard all that scholarship that they did do. Because people are writing tons of books and teaching tons of classes on the Bible around the world, and it's just we can't listen to that. And
as a result, they miss out on stuff because there's just so much stuff in the Bible that's really cool that Christadelphians miss out on because they're arrogant. And when I say
the culture you're not saying an individual person, so it's okay.
Yeah, people accuse me of being arrogant. And they're right, because I had really good teachers. I had years of being brought up in an environment where I just learned how to be arrogant.
Confident. I'm going to say confident.
Right. Thanks. Yeah, that sounds better. But it is there is an arrogance to that. Like, we have the truth, and without the truth, you can't understand the rest. So it doesn't matter how much study you do, you won't really understand it because you don't have the truth.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's very dismissive of.
I found a lot of ex-Christadelphians that I know, when they've left Christadelphians, they've abandoned all religion, and that's perfectly understandable.
Very
I'm not
common.
critical.
Yep.
And I'm not religious now. I wouldn't say I'm one of those people. I've kind of abandoned religion, but I'm one of the few ex-Christadelphians that I know that is still interested in the Bible, because most have just abandoned the Bible completely, and it's understandable, when people leave, that they blame the Bible for a lot of the hurt that they've suffered, so they just stop reading the Bible. They're not interested in the Bible. But so for me, I'm maybe a bit of an oddity in having left. I actually probably now read the Bible more than I ever did, but from a totally different perspective.
You with that, yeah.
Yeah, so I am an oddity. Yeah,
a secular Bible reader.
Yeah, I don't read the Bible devotionally. I don't sort of sit down and read the Bible to say, what is God saying to me? It is, I'm reading the Bible as, what was this guy saying to his audience and why?
So what are some of the classes that you teach and your favorite things to learn and share about now from the Bible?
So I teach biblical Hebrew. We go through biblical texts. So when students are learning biblical Hebrew, they learn the grammar and all that kind of stuff, but then we'll actually work our way through a text. So I teach those sessions where we work through various texts. I read them in Hebrew and so on. So they're learning about grammar and syntax as we go. Okay. But we're also just unraveling a particular biblical text. So I teach various parts of the Bible on that. But then we also teach, in biblical studies, I teach prophets, apocalyptic literature, which includes non-biblical stuff like the Book of Enoch and all those other books that are Jewish literature from the biblical period, but not in the canon of the Scripture. But when you're reading something like Revelation, you think, to understand Revelation, you need to understand Daniel and also Enoch and 4 Ezra and 2 Baruch and all these other books that are written around at the same time because they're very similar.
You finally got your answer to Revelation.
Yeah.
You were missing all of those other books.
Yeah, but I guess every time I find an answer, I also end up with a few more questions. So,
fair enough.
Which is what it's about. Finding more questions. I think it's part of it. In fact, I say to students all the time, because I'll come to a class and say, so what does this mean? I go, okay, there's 3 ways, 3 ways that I know it. This could mean A, B, or C. And they go and they say, so which is the right one? It's A, B, or C,
Yeah.
I said, what do you believe? And I think it doesn't matter. Like you work it out, kind of thing. It's
yeah.
And you might come up with a D or an E, so something else.
Absolutely.
It's about going away with more questions is part of the process rather than having your questions answered.
And empowering the students to learn. Yeah, they're figuring out on their own.
Yeah.
That's awesome. And then be curious to hear about what it's been like for you finding community since leaving, since you were a pretty avid churchgoer for a long time. And if you're connected still to any Christadelphians or ex-Christadelphians.
I think one of the and maybe this is a fairly universal experience for people who leave Christadelphianism, is a loss of community, maybe, because there is a big focus amongst Christadelphians on being a global community, and they are successful at that to varying degrees. And I guess initially there is that loss. And for us initially, it was nice to be away from an environment that we thought was a bit toxic or very toxic in some areas. But with time, it's kind of like, but you need community, and that's why we probably went searching for something else to find community. For me now, community, I find it in academia. In Australia, we have an academic organisation called the Fellowship for Biblical Studies.
Okay.
So they're all academics. You've got to have a PhD.
That makes sense, for
to be in it. I'm actively involved in that. And
don't worry, I'm not sad I'm not in it. I know I can't keep
right.
up.
I mean, globally, there's other organisations like that, like the Society of Biblical Literature, which is US based and has been going for over 100 years and so on. So there are communities of biblical scholars, and I do find a real sense of community amongst academics studying the Bible.
Nice.
And I have friends who come from a variety of backgrounds. They could be They could be Jewish, they could be Catholic, they could be Orthodox, they could be Protestant, they could be nothing, they could be atheists, and it's all studying the Bible, and no one cares what religious background other people come from. They're just interested in your approach to studying the Bible and so on. So I find for me that's a real sense of community. But one of the other things for me was the ecclesia I grew up in, where I left. To this day, people who I thought were my friends have still not contacted me to say, "Why did you leave?" Like, I stopped going, and no one, they didn't ask, whatever.
No, so
and then
never reached out.
Yeah, and then the last ecclesia we belonged to, when we drifted away, again to this day, very few people have contacted us to say, "Why did you leave?" So I thought, okay, I kind of had to reassess what friendship was all about, and the friends I have now are deep, abiding friendships. I have good mates that I love, and I know they love me, and it's different. It's just, it's unconditional. It's got nothing to do with religion. It's just you love someone because you love them.
Yeah, and that's that quality over quantity, because with a Christadelphian culture, you can go anywhere and find someone who will like take you in and bring you to meeting and all that kind of stuff, sit with you. But when you leave, in most cases, generally just very quickly turn their back on you, may or may not talk about you behind your back with negative things. Oh, they're sinful. Oh, they left. They did this. They did that. Whereas it is pretty cool to see the difference in trying to cultivate friendships with people in the broader community outside of a religious space, and seeing that too. Because I've definitely had the same experience of having such deep friendships that I never had when I was a Christadelphian.
Yeah.
So I'm so glad to hear you've had that.
The Christadelphian love is very conditional. We love you as long as you check all the boxes and you don't change your beliefs or your ideas on things. It's very conditional. Yeah. Whereas the friends I have now, they don't care what I believe about things. So
yeah. And you don't care what they believe. You're not trying to try to force them to believe something different. There's no pressure to preach at them either.
Exactly. You just care about each other, but not what you believe. Yeah.
And it's really a lot more about your actions than your beliefs.
Yeah. So I guess so for me, I've found community elsewhere, but that was initially something that I really did feel we'd lost. Yeah.
Yeah, that transition can be really rough. Yeah.
Yeah, very much so.
Are you connected with the ex-Christadelphian community online or no? Because I don't think I ever saw you in like the Facebook or anything.
No, I'm not connected with that group. And I guess, I don't know why. When we left, some friends did suggest to me or invite me to join or whatever. And maybe I felt I didn't need it. Like I didn't need to.
Yeah, you're in a very different space. It seems like you're in a very healthy place and all. It's more of a support group kind of thing. So, yeah. Yeah,
I didn't feel like I had any real issues that I needed support to be supported through or anything like that. I didn't feel I needed that. And I didn't think I felt I had anything to offer either. To other people. So,
come on. This is so interesting hearing your story.
Yeah. Anyway, for whatever reason, I didn't join those groups. I do know some ex-Christadelphians who back at that stage I thought were very, very angry and very bitter, and I could understand that. But that also wasn't my experience, and I just didn't feel it was healthy for me to be hanging around people who were bitter and angry at the time. So I guess some of those connections I had with other with some Christadelphians we just drifted apart because we didn't have the same sort of experiences and whatever. Yeah. So I don't have very many Christadelphian friends. I do have ex-Christadelphian friends. People have left.
That's generally what I hear. Generally, more ex-Christadelphians tend to find each other, but often the Christadelphians kind of stay with their own group too.
Yeah, I have family who are still Christadelphians, relatives and who Christadelphians, and so I have, I kind of hear news about what's going on. Oh, and I meet up sometimes with old Christadelphian friends at weddings and funerals and that kind of thing, and it's all very friendly when I do usually.
Do they ever ask you more about your biblical studies and all that kind of stuff?
Yep, I think people do. They say, "What are you doing now?" And I, tell them what I'm doing, and they want to have a bit of a chat about that. But it's just friendly. But I think most of the currently Christadelphian people that I do connect with those sorts of places would be from the more progressive end of the Christadelphian spectrum in Australia, not from where I was brought up. Less so with that look, they tell me it's changed, and they tell me that this polarity between these two ends of the spectrum is not the same now, and that there's much more common ground they've met, and that's good for them. It's just not my experience. It's happened since I left or whatever. So it's whatever. So but at that very conservative end of the spectrum, I have absolutely no interest in having any contact with them at all, because it was talk. There was things at one stage we had to change our telephone number because this is when everyone had landlines, not mobiles.
Yeah, I know. Yeah. I was there for that.
So, but we had to, because I remember we came home from being out shopping or something one day. We came home with the family and there was a voicemail message, and I listened to the voicemail message, and it was it was vulgar and obscene. It was abusive from a Christadelphian who was complaining because of something I allegedly said and whatever. And we had to change the number because we thought we didn't want our daughters ever coming home listening to the voicemail message and getting that. I mean, thinking if this is what the truth is for these people, they can have it, and we had to change our number. And that happened more than once. We had to change our phone number and it was just this awful nastiness where we thought we've left, but they weren't satisfied with that. They had to keep tracking me down.
Oh, it was during that time. And
it was years after that. They would never. Some of them would not let it go. Yeah, would not let it go, and then it was just absolutely awful.
They're basically harassing you at that point.
Yeah.
That's inappropriate. Well, I'm sorry to hear that for you. It sounds like that may have been on the more extreme end of the things that you've experienced, because you had a lot of positive experiences as well. But hopefully that culture did change. But I also am skeptical that it's a healthy culture across the board that everyone is experiencing. You had kind of a smooth little sail out of Christadelphianism. So I usually like to ask a few wrap-up questions to ask would you have any advice for people who are leaving? But I'm curious if you would or not, because yours was just slowly leaving.
I'm not sure, because everyone's different. We're all unique. Mm-hmm. Well, something I have noted, though, amongst some ex-Christadelphians that I've encountered is that, as I said, a lot of them don't read the Bible anymore. The Bible interests me, but it doesn't interest everybody. So I understand that. But I've seen ex-Christadelphians become atheists, and that's fine too. I mean, I have no problem with that. Some of my best friends are atheists. And maybe I am, I don't know. But
it just sounds like the title of a play to me. All my best friends are atheists.
Yeah, exactly. So, but I think often they ditch the baby with the bathwater, as the expression is, in that they want to jettison everything that was part of their Christadelphian experience. So I've heard some people have irrational reasons for why you reject the Bible. And I think you actually don't really understand the Bible if that's your basis for rejecting it. What I mean by rejecting the Bible, I mean, you can reject it as a basis for telling people how they should live their lives. Absolutely, I've rejected. The Bible is not a basis for telling other people how to live their lives. So I reject that as well. Is the Bible completely useless? No, I don't think so. I mean, it has kept me in a job the last few years too, I suppose. So it's not
Good reason.
it's not completely useless. Yeah. But I think so, because Christadelphians are also so pro-Israel in lots of ways, because the Bible is a Jewish book written in Israel, and Christadelphians have a huge emphasis on prophecy, which is, from a Christadelphian perspective, all about Israel. So Christadelphians to me are very pro-Israel. I have seen Christadelphians become very anti-Israel. Ex-Christadelphians. So I'm thinking, so
almost
because
like
you
a
associate,
whiplash,
that's a good term, whiplash. Yeah, because you're thinking they associate Israel with their Christadelphian experience, they become anti-Israel, and I think that's irrational.
Well, if that's the only basis, I mean, there's other reasons to maybe not be happy about certain things. But...
and I have Israeli friends who are opposed to the Netanyahu government, but so I
there's
can
a
have
lot
my
of
own
nuance
opinion
in the world. Yeah,
exactly. And I can have my own opinion about the government of Israel, but that does not mean I had to become an anti-Semite. But I've met Christadelphians who are anti-Semitic now, who have ex-Christadelphians who make anti-Semitic remarks about Jews. That I think it's just it's part of their whiplash, So
people can definitely like overcompensate almost is something I think about too, where like you leave and it's just like an over dramatized reaction or response to something. But often I think that's because it's still something that's very triggering to you. And so it's almost an exaggerated response because you haven't been able to find a place where you're balanced and calm to work through those things. And that's where maybe, therapy and mindfulness and those sorts of things can be helpful if you're having a very strong reaction to something, to kind of sit down and start thinking about what could help and why that's happening. Because there's definitely, so much emotionality with religion. It's supposed to be all about your eternal life. A lot of people have trauma and abuse that comes out of that and those experiences. So that's all valid, but it is a shame if it causes you to struggle with relationships or to have these responses that maybe you recognize as maybe not appropriate or not healthy or interfere with relationships or whatever it may be. So definitely something to think about. And I think I've seen that too sometimes. And like I said with Rob, I think it's almost like you're going through stages of grief oftentimes. And so it can be healthy at times to have anger. It can be, where you're going through feelings of loss and sadness, but hopefully you're moving on that path and going through those as many times as you have to, all of those feelings, until you get to a point where generally you're in a more healed place and you're in a healthier place for you. And you've replaced a lot of the negative things in your life with some more positive things. That's why it's so great to hear about people finding community after losing community, instead of dwelling in, I lost this community and they didn't treat me well, but more focus on day to day. I have community and it's better than I had there. And I'm so grateful for it. You can definitely change your mindset as you change your environment and let go of some of the things that were weighing you down. Because everyone goes through hard things, but hopefully we're all getting some good things out of life and connecting and growing and learning.
Yeah, I think also for me, finding community is not necessarily finding another group. I mean, I say I'm found like academic groups I can be involved in, but community for my real community is just my friends. They're not a group.
Yeah, I think that's a healthy way, to be.
I think I've always found it hard as a Christadelphian to make good friendships, because growing up, at school, it was like, your friend, you don't make your friends at school, you make your friends in the meeting.
You're not supposed to. Yeah.
And so growing up, we couldn't do any school activities that were on a weekend, for example. Could go to birthday parties and things, but parents didn't actually encourage it, because your friends are in the meeting, not at school. But I didn't really have friends at the meeting. I mean, they weren't good friends. My best friends were at school, not in the meeting, and so that's where you have to make your friends. And they weren't really deep friendships, I don't think. And I think as a result of that, I had problems making friends.
Oh.
Yeah.
Because I think it can help with leaving. Because I've heard of some people really getting kind of stuck in there for a long time, where they've checked out more on the emotional, mental level of like believing in it, but where they want to see family and friends and things like that. And it's just part of their community to see these people and chat and go out to lunch or whatever. But I can definitely see that being harder to make friends. I definitely struggled with some of that.
Yeah. So now I do. I have like good friends or whatever, but it was completely different to my Christadelphian experience of friendships, which were
Absolutely.
more superficial, I thought,
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. So it sounds like you had a very unique thought process with how you went about things after you'd left. So I'd be curious if there was anything that you read or were thinking about or listening to that was helpful for you in maybe just changing your perspective on the Bible or religion or something that you might want to share with people that you still maybe think about or found really helpful during that time period of like shifting from being Christadelphian.
It's a really good question. And unfortunately, I don't have a really good answer.
Well, I was wondering because you didn't like have like a deconstruction like thing, like reading and watching and listening.
I read very widely. And
I can
I've
tell.
always been a reader, and I read a lot.
Yeah.
I have a lot of wide interests now. I read all sorts of weird stuff. So I just encourage people to read widely. Just don't try and be connected to any particular philosophy or point of view or whatever. Just read widely. Just
stay curious,
experience.
stay open-minded.
Yeah, stay open-minded. Yeah, just read all sorts of things. That's why I don't like to check boxes. People say to me, "Oh, since you've been at university, have you become an atheist or an agnostic or anything?" I don't like checking boxes. I don't like being put in boxes either. And you can ask me, I could tell you, right at this moment, I'm feeling agnostic. Tomorrow I might feel differently, whatever, So
that's true too. You should always be allowed to evolve and not have to just stay one thing just to make someone else happy. Where they're like, well, now they know who I am.
Yeah.
We can grow and change. Why not? You were Christadelphian once, and now you dropped that label. You left that box.
Yeah. I can tell you what I believe about things right now, but I'm not sure how I feel about the same subject in an hour's time when I read something else.
You never know.
My opinion changes that quickly, but have an open mind. Be prepared
always
to change.
Open. Yeah, you're open to the evidence and whatever happens. Okay.
Absolutely.
That's a great, I think, view for a professor to have. So I think that's very healthy. I'm sure the students love that. And are there any stories that you'd wanted to share that we didn't get to today, just with our chats?
There's a lot of stories I could tell.
Okay, well, tell me. I didn't get an answer the first time. What is the approved color for conservative Christadelphian underwear? Because I was told it's not colored. So what is it, like white or black? Like what's the non-colored option?
It depends what part of Christadelphianism you're in. Like,
is it blue to match the suits? Like, come on, I don't know.
I remember from your interview with Rob that he talked about some experience where he was visiting some cousins or something, and he had his coloured underwear on the clothesline, and was questioned about that.
And that's why I was like, wait, so what colour was all the other underwear?
So in our family, I didn't realise coloured underwear was an issue at all. Growing up, as your parents mum bought our underwear and whatever, and I didn't even know it was an issue, and had multicoloured or whatever. It was just as long as it performed its function. But I remember going to a youth conference. It was a week-long thing in Adelaide.
Okay.
And it was when I was still in the Logos end of the spectrum, and so it was very conservative. And the ecclesia I went to was probably the most conservative in Sydney, but they were even more conservative in Adelaide. And this is where the Logos magazine came from and the whole thing. So it was,
Okay, makes sense. Yeah, that was where the stronghold.
And I remember being in the boys' dormitory one day, and someone came in and said, all the interstate guys get out, go out the back door and get out. They're about to do an underwear inspection. I thought, what?
No way.
I thought, why is this anything for all the interstate guys to get out? And
did you have to grab your underwear and like stuff it in your pocket?
What's the underwear? So we just all bolted out the back door and ran. And afterwards, so what's all this about? These guys knew, because we were in the dormitory, they knew the interstate guys didn't have the rules on underwear, so we didn't have the regulation white. So we would get
white.
So they had to wear white underwear, and so they were already warning us, get out, because they knew we wouldn't pass the test. So we got out.
Wait, were they going to make you show the underwear you were wearing?
So the boys had to strip down to their underwear, and this hosts, the male hosts,
many levels.
This was hugely problematic because not only I thought at first this is just bizarre. These people really are weird. But
what does that have to do with the Bible? Show me the Bible verse where that says you have to wear white underwear.
And it was later that I realised, because of some other incidents that were happening in Adelaide, that this was part of the grooming process. They were selecting boys to be groomed as well. And so some of these boys were later sexually abused. So the underwear inspection was a way of checking out what kind of boys you might...
Well, that's what I mean. I was like, you have all these young men who are then put in a vulnerable position where they're in their underwear. They have someone with authority coming in, power, and that situation is just uneven power dynamics, and it's so inappropriate on so many levels. Like, if I had a kid and I sent them to any kind of camp and they're like, oh, the teacher was there with me and I was only in my underwear because they told me I had to be, they would not hear the end of it from me.
Yeah. We had a Royal Commission in Australia a few years ago into institutionalised child abuse, and I was really sure that Christadelphians were going to be part of that, because some of the other churches were. They were brought in, they were questioned about their approaches to institutionalised sexual abuse. Mm-hmm. But Christadelphians were probably too small. They just didn't get picked up on their radar at all. But
I would think, most people have never heard of them. They don't even know how to pronounce it.
And so they didn't. But it was around that time I made a comment on a forum or something, some sort of internet forum, about this experience, about the underwear inspection in Adelaide, and how I know it led to grooming. And I know, sadly, one of those boys, took his own life. Someone who had been sexually abused.
Happens. Yeah, one of the books I read on someone else who had left a religion, it was similar. Her brother died, and it was suicide after being molested in a church environment.
So I made a comment about these underwear inspections, and I got an email or a phone call or something from a Christadelphian in Adelaide who wanted me to remove that from the internet completely because he didn't want it to be picked up by the Royal Commission. And he said the reason, and I said, why? So what if it is picked up? What? But the reason for his concern was that this person was responsible for organising the insurance policies for ecclesias, and that an insurer would not insure them if there was any hint of potential abuse. He wasn't concerned about boys being abused. He was concerned about their premiums on their insurance going up.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. Wow, that is insightful. Oh my goodness.
But so it's not a funny story. It seems a funny story about his underwear inspections. It was a tragic story. Yeah.
It's tragic in the end, and I'm very, very sad to hear that someone lost their life to someone else's poor behavior that was not regulated, and that even after that, there was no thought for the victim and their family, but it was for themselves and their money. That is very disappointing to hear.
Yeah.
It is interesting to hear about this push from Christadelphians to talk about child abuse all of a sudden. And it just looks an awful lot like trying to keep their insurance coverage and do the mandatory child abuse reporting that they have to do.
Yeah.
So I'm very skeptical of it based on the lived history of so many Christadelphians and having been in the culture and seeing a lot of things.
Right. In my experience, I think the ecclesias who are the most conservative, the most rigid, and they're strictest in their adherence to doctrines are the ones where child abuse is most likely to occur, because for them it's about orthodoxy, right doctrine, not orthopraxy, right conduct. And in fact, one of the people who, back when I was in my early 20s, one of the people who was appointed to interrogate me week after week about my views on Revelation, I found out later was molesting his teenage daughter at the same time. So my right doctrine was more important than the way he treated his own daughter, which was absolutely appalling. And in the end, when I was disfellowshipped by that ecclesia, I was disfellowshipped because of my understanding of the word "at" in clause 29, I think it was, of the Statement of Faith. Because they really couldn't find whether I believed anything wrong. They really couldn't after all that time. But they, in the end, they just, I have a different understanding of the word "at." I don't know. Can you have so? But so this is the level of the orthodoxy. You can disfellowship somebody over their understanding of two letters, but you can sexually abuse your own daughter at the same time, and that's okay.
Yeah. So Yeah, was he disfellowshipped at any time for that?
No, he wasn't.
Was he reported to the police at any time for that you're aware
No,
of?
he wasn't. He was just told to stop.
Did he? Did that work out so well?
I have no idea.
Yeah.
But someone did provide housing for her, yeah. So,
Good. Because I feel like if you do nothing, then I'm appalled.
Yeah.
So I'm glad that was at least one thing to move her to a safer environment. But if she still has to see him every Sunday, then that's not enough.
Yeah. And I left the ecclesia by the time that sort of came out, so I don't know how it ended up. So. But I guess that was just part of my experience was there is this total emphasis on the truth, but you can tell lies at the same time. But you've got the truth is about doctrine. It's not about telling the truth. Oh, you've got time for one more quick story? I can tell one story about that if you've got time for it, is that...
we got time.
So this was before we'd left Christadelphians, but after I'd left that Logos.
The first one, okay.
There was an ecclesia. Part of this divisiveness amongst Christadelphians is they're always criticising each other. You know, you find ecclesias are disfellowship in other ecclesias. It was just an ongoing thing. Yeah. And there was an ecclesia, interstate, not a local one here. It was an interstate ecclesia that some ecclesias in the area wanted to reprimand or disfellowship or whatever. They were trying to move them towards being disfellowship, I think. And there was a speaker from these would go around and to the other ecclesias saying why this particular ecclesia should be disfellowshipped, and had a PowerPoint presentation that went with it.
PowerPoint.
And anyway, somebody in that area got a copy of the PowerPoint presentation and a recording of the address and sent it to me because I thought I'd be interested in it. Because a third of their talk, of this person's talk, was this ecclesia should be disfellowship because they had Stephen Cook as a speaker.
Whoa.
And his PowerPoint presentation had, this is what Stephen Cook believes in his own words. And it was a whole lot of quotations apparently taken from the internet as to what I believe.
Interesting.
These slides was not what I believe, nor was it in my own words. In fact, when I read it, I thought that is not what I believe, and that is not even how I would say it if I did believe that. They are not the kinds of words I would use. So they completely fabricated what I believe.
Wow.
A complete fabrication to have an agenda to get rid of this other ecclesia, which failed in the end. But they had this agenda, and so they were prepared to lie in defense of the truth.
Yeah, that is quite a statement right there, and that's not the first time I'm hearing examples of that for sure. I also can't believe, that's a defamation lawsuit right there. Quite honestly, that's pretty bold. If someone started doing that, I feel like someone should set up, the presiding brother and be like, actually, we're done with this presentation now. Someone should have shut that down when it was we're specifically going to, shit on this person who's not here to defend himself. That is very problematic.
I contacted this brother who was a speaker, who was an elderly person who was doing this talk. I contacted him at the time and said, you've said this has come from the internet. Can you give me the URL, the URLs of where that's on the internet? And his answer was, what's a URL? And I thought, so you actually haven't found this on the internet yourself because you don't even know what a URL is. So you haven't found this.
You're not very good with the internet,
So you've been fed this information from somewhere else. And I think that was just thoroughly wicked. I think that somebody who maybe had an agenda against me for whatever reason fabricates stuff and then feeds it to someone who is out of his depth and just says, you can trust this has come from the internet. This is what Stephen Cook says in his own words. And it was just, lies.
And it's just shameless too, just up on the podium with a microphone spewing this lies. That's terrible.
Yeah.
And again, sorry you had to go through that. That sounds very uncomfortable. I'm glad you at least confronted him about it, because you can't just let that sit there. That's crazy.
Yeah. Anyway, and he was elderly, and I wasn't going to pursue it because I thought he's been duped anyhow. So by someone who was, and he wouldn't tell me his source. So, but I think I know who it was. But yeah,
they do tend to protect their own, unfortunately. And again, you would think, don't you guys value the truth? So wouldn't you just immediately tell me who it was? Because isn't that what you're all about? Is truth? Wouldn't that also include honesty and transparency? But apparently not.
So for me, this is where I noticed a real difference. There's this emphasis on having the truth.
Mm-hmm.
But at the same time, I was brought up in a family where honesty was just such an important thing, and my dad,
Character.
And like at his funeral, hundreds of people were there because of his integrity.
Mm-hmm.
And that wasn't because he was a Christadelphian. That was because he was an integrous person. And so I had this real thing there is I was brought up with this thing to value honesty, to value the truth. But then there's the Christadelphian view of the truth, which was not consistent with that. So, and in the end, that's why, for me, it was kind of like I don't want to be part of that institution. So I lost my faith in church first.
Yeah, I think that's fair. Yeah, nothing wrong there. I do definitely agree. I've met so many wonderful people, they'll give you their shirt off their back who are like atheists who would have been demonized by Christadelphians. And then I've met so many Christadelphians who, again, have been involved with things that harm Christadelphians and have treated people badly both within and without of their ecclesias. And it's pretty shameful. It's pretty sad. So I think it's great when we can be around good people who treat each other well and hopefully, make our communities a little bit better. Thanks again, Steve, for coming on the podcast. It's been delightful to chat with you and very interesting to hear your perspective, especially since leaving and getting into biblical studies. I'm also excited to say that you will be back on at least one other future episode this season. So I'm excited to chat with you again. And thanks again for coming on. Take care and we'll see you next time, everybody. Bye. Thank you to everyone who has helped make this episode of the podcast possible. Today's episode was edited by me, Zinnia. I'd also like to thank Al Kroons for creating our intro music and the ex-Christadelphians that submitted audio for the intro music. If you'd like to join our community, you can find us at the group for ex-Christadelphians on Facebook. You can also follow our social media on Facebook and Instagram at Life After Leaving Podcast. If you'd like to come on the podcast, reach out to me at lifeafterleavingpodcast@gmail.com. And if you're enjoying this podcast, please consider leaving a rating and review or sharing this podcast with a friend. That's all for today. Thanks and see you next time.